This is a lecture from Open Tuition. To benefit from the lecture, you should download the free lecture notes from opentuition.com.
The final two chapters deal with human resources planning and human resources management. And this is very important. Certainly in practice, it's very important. Human resource management can be defined as the strategic and coherent approach to the management of an organization's most valuable assets, the people working there, who individually and collectively contribute to the achievements of its objective. So human resources can be, we talk about financial resources, we talk about machinery, etc., their resources. Your customers are resources, material are resources, and we're saying you can't do anything either without a coherent and planned approach and a strategic, in other words, thinking about a long-term approach to the people you're going to be employing. And in fact, it's much more difficult, and many managers will say, people running their own business will say, the most difficult aspect of management is human resource management. And that managing your finances and your suppliers and your customers pales into insignificance compared to that. Now, what may be causing some of these particular difficulties here? Well, first of all, at the moment anyway, we have in many Western countries changes in the population, so there are fewer younger people coming onto the job market, so there's greater competition for them. Secondly, many jobs are more complicated. There aren't that many jobs now where keyboard skills are not required. Even in what would be traditionally a more perhaps manually based job, say a plumber, there are more and more regulations coming out about, for example, safety. There are new products coming out, more complicated boilers, etc., coming out and so on. And whereas it used to be that people would, do their training and that would be it for life, now very often they have to go back every year to almost recertify to make sure they're up to date and conforming with best practice and so on. So you need people who are able to deal with this kind of lifelong learning. A move from manufacturing to service industries, and we've said before, we were talking about marketing, we talked about people when you got to marketing of services, because in the service industry there's much more interaction between your employees and your customers, and if there's more interaction between the employees and the customers, perhaps your employees need to be better or better trained, and need to be able to, because the service is kind of delivered simultaneously, immediately, they have to get it right first time. There is not quite the same opportunity for quality control checks. In manufacturing, you can hide most of your employees away, you can have quality control tests before the product gets out, but not so much in service industries. There are more frequent job changes. When I was young, my grandparents, who I suppose would say to me, go and get a job in a bank when you're 16, you can stay there till you're 66 or whatever. And then, of course, they'd come through all sorts of awful economic depressions and wars and so on. They saw the goal was the security of a kind of job for life. Not only do people not want that anymore in general, but you're almost expected to move around a little bit. And if you've been more than 5 years with one employer, people almost look at you and say, well, can't you find another job? And of course, if more people are moving out at the top after their 3 or 5 years, then it puts a bigger burden on recruitment to get the right people coming in to replace them. And finally, there might be, although this depends very much on the economic situation you're in, there might be a potential change in work-life balance in times of good economic prospects, where people are confident about their jobs or confident about getting another job. If you as an employer say something to an employee which the employee doesn't like, they are liable just to leave and get another job. So maybe we have to be careful in managing them, or if we don't live up to their expectations, if we don't provide them with the training they expect or the environment they expect. Then if there is opportunity, they will move on. Or they'll simply say, I don't want to work Saturdays. I'm working hard enough, I'm earning enough, I don't want to work Saturdays. Now this changes if you have a poor economic situation or prospects and so on. People are likely to want to hang on to their job. So that kind of goes up and down a little bit. Second bullet point here about human resource management is that your human resources leave your premises and go home every evening. And there is no guarantee whatsoever that they are going to appear with you tomorrow morning. There is nothing to stop them transferring their effort to a competitor. Now, you don't get that with your plant and machinery, It's there in the evening, it's going to be there in the morning. It's certainly not going to dedicate itself to making products for your competitor. So these are assets which are very movable assets and which can easily disappear and you can do nothing about it. And then finally, people are not machines. Their performance varies depending on their mood, depending maybe on how you've spoken to them, depending on how you've made them enthusiastic, how you've motivated them, depending maybe on their colleagues and how they're getting on with their colleagues here. And some days they might perform well, sometimes you don't perform so well, and so on there. So getting a reproducible, dependable, predictable performance from people is also really quite tricky and not nearly as easy to predict as with machines. So a lot of problems in getting the right people, keeping them and getting them working in a way which is going to be useful to you. Now the human resources cycle can be regarded as this. So you start off with planning. How many people do we need? And then there's going to be a process of selection, finding the people we need. And we'll be looking at these in a little bit more detail in a moment, but we have to advertise for people, you have to generally shortlist, interview, select them and offer them the job and so on. You have to induct them into the company, you have to maybe do a little bit of training, you certainly have to introduce them to colleagues and so on, show them how the system works, give them the log-ons and so on. Then they're in their job and you have to try to motivate them, you have to try to enthuse them in their job to make them work hard and enthusiastically. So if you get good output from them, I don't just mean high volume, I mean also high quality output from people. And then there's usually a form of appraisal every year where you look maybe back as to how they've done over the previous year and you look forward as to what they might be doing in the future and what training they might need in the future. And also usually at this appraisal stage you may be fixing next year's salary or telling them what their bonus is and so on. So let's look at these in just a little bit more detail. Planning's pretty easy. Ideally a company, the directors at the top should have their eye on what's happening in this company, where's it going to be in 5 years and 3 years and 10 years and so on. And they should be thinking, as well as considering how many shops are we going to need, how many factories are we going to need in 3 or 5 years, they should be thinking how many people with certain skills are we going to need in 3 or 5 years. Because whereas you can go down to the local kind of machinery shop and buy 10 machines nearly at once, it's actually harder to go and recruit 10 suitable people at once. They may not actually be available. So what you do is you say, what are the plans for the business? And the plans for the business will give you an idea. Let's say it's engineers. We'll give you an idea of how many engineers we're going to need in 5 years' time. And let's say we think we're going to need 1,000 in 5 years' time. And what we have now is maybe 300 engineers. There's a considerable expansion going on. So this is over a 5-year period, remember, here. So what we say is we have to think, well, how many people of those 300 do we think are going to leave? So maybe we think 100 leave. These are maybe youngish people and they want to get lots of experience. Let's say nobody retires. Let's say they're all too young for that. So we're down to 200. So what we have is a kind of recruitment burden here of plus 800. So maybe if we recruit, something, maybe around 300 per annum, something of that sort. No, it's going to be over 5 years, I beg your pardon. Maybe about 150 a year. That's the sort of thing that we're going to be aiming for. So over 5 years, 150, 160, something in that order. And it's not going to be right. This is future planning. It's never going to be right. But we need to know whether we, over 5 years, are going to need 15 more people, 5 more people, 150 more people, or 1,000 more people. Because if we don't start the recruitment process now, and maybe start going into universities and get people used to our names and so on, we're simply not going to be able to hit this 800 without this planning. So we know, roughly speaking, how many people of what skills have to be recruited. And this almost gives you authorization, the authority to recruit. Because once you've recruited somebody, it's a lot of money, a lot of expense each year. So we don't want to recruit too many. And then we begin the selection process. So we'll start this here with these 3 steps. Job analysis, job description, and the person specification. And job analysis is finding out what is the job. Because just looking at the job title will not tell you that. So you might say, I need an accounts assistant, but what's meant by that phrase, accounts assistant? In one company, they might envisage this person just doing kind of debits and credits in the receivables ledger. In another company, they might say, well, this accounts assistant is going to be working a lot with Excel, and is going to be doing a lot of budgeting and so on. In another organisation, they say, well, this accounts assistant is going to actually be ringing up customers and suppliers a lot. There's going to be a lot of kind of interpersonal skills needed as well. So lying behind this phrase or title, accounts assistant, there's a whole variety of potential jobs. And what job analysis is to actually find out what is the job. Because until you know what the job is, you can't possibly recruit anybody. On the basis of this, so this is the analysis and the job description, this is the result of the analysis. We now know what the job is. We can say, how much of the time they're going to be working in Excel, how good they need to be at it. We can say whether they're going to be working in some sort of accounting package and how good they need to be at that and so on. Whether they're going to be in charge of some other assistants, whether they're going to be liaising with top management and so on. So we can describe the job, and from that then we can get on to what's called a person specification. And the person specification is saying the sorts of qualities that the person might have who's going to be successful in the job. So maybe they have certain qualifications and certain amount of experience and so on here. There's sometimes a kind of mnemonic given for this person specification, which is called bad pigs. So it's a little bit out of date now, but it doesn't matter. This is called Roger's 7-point selection plan, so it is. But the B stood for background. Now it's gone out of date because it kind of used to be, we went for a job interview. I can't remember going for a job interview, and I was asked almost one of the first questions, what does your father do? And you kind of think, well, not actually any of your business. How's that relevant to what I'm doing? But at one stage things were slightly different, and there were some jobs, that you always be ruled out of if you didn't have it in your family history. Thank goodness we got away from that. But background could be relevant, like where do you live? So if you're living, 100 kilometers away, and have to travel backwards and forwards 100 kilometers every day, even through winter, and you're going to have to work late quite often, so it's going to be really late by the time you get home, it might be valid to put a little bit of a question mark in front of that person and ask them, well, do you think you're going to be able to do that commuting, especially if you have to work late? Next thing we have is achievements. So achievements is like your educational qualifications and achievements. Have you got a driving license? Have you got a degree? Have you got an accountancy qualification? And so on. What sort of experience do you have working in previous organisations, in the accounting department, in the sales ledger, and the like? D is your disposition. It could be, are you cheerful? Are you talkative? Because if you're in a customer-facing organisation, if you're going to be hired as a kind of receptionist or a salesperson, then you expect these people to be reasonably pleasant, cheerful people. And if you are someone who doesn't like looking somebody in the eye, then maybe your strengths are more in the technical field than in the interpersonal fields. So disposition, and we've all no doubt come across people, maybe on reception desks, maybe the people who answer the phone, who really shouldn't be doing it because they're grumpy people. And nobody wants to be confronted with a grumpy receptionist. Physical. Have to be a bit careful with physical. We'll be getting on at some point to looking at discrimination. We have to be careful not to discriminate against people who maybe got physical disabilities. For many office jobs and accounting jobs, the physical qualifications are negligible. But for some jobs they are essential. If you're going to be an airline pilot, you have to have good eyesight. You can't be colorblind. You need to know the red and the green lights, whether that other plane's coming towards me or going away from me, and so on. So for some purposes, there are legitimate physical qualifications which are going to be needed. I is your interests, almost your hobbies outside work. It can give you something to talk about at the interview. But also you can maybe say from that person's interests, can I get some insight into their personality, their disposition. So if somebody is the captain of the local amateur football team, then it's giving quite a bit away. This person has probably got considerable leadership skills and probably quite a sociable person. If, however, they are pursuing a kind of solitary habit, maybe stamp collecting, then maybe they're not going to be a great salesperson, maybe. But they might be very, very good at recording inventory movements. It's just a different kind of a personality and skill set which we might have there. G is a general intelligence. I talked earlier on about maybe a need for ongoing lifetime learning and so on there. And if somebody comes to you without very many formal educational qualifications, yet going into something which requires them to be able to learn, then their general intelligence may be important, and maybe we have to actually test it. And finally, the S is for special aptitudes. Special aptitudes, so some people have got special aptitudes for learning languages. Other people have got special aptitudes for computer programming and so on. And there are methods of testing for the presence of these special aptitudes which will help us maybe to select people for certain jobs. But these can form these bad pigs, if you like here, these 7 kind of characteristics, can form at least the basis of a person's specification. What sort of person is likely to be successful doing this sort of a job? And then what we have to do is to attract candidates. And we can do that by advertising ourselves. Many candidates now find jobs in the internet where we might advertise, or we can go to an agency, an employment agency. An employment agency may have people on their books looking for a new job. Some employment agencies specialise maybe in a accounting staff or computer staff and so on there. The employment agency can keep a bit of confidentiality going, because if I advertise in a newspaper for 5 engineers, then of course my competitors will see, oh, he's advertising, is he going to be expanding, and so on. So we can have to attract candidates. Ideally, I suppose, you maybe want to attract for one job, maybe about 30 applications, something of that sort. You don't want just 2, you don't want 300, you want 30 maybe applications. You look through them and you shortlist, and maybe you interview about 5. Interviewings are often done very badly. There are frequently not very good ways of picking the right person. They're very skilled. You're supposed to answer or ask open questions. So if you ask someone, can you deal with tight deadlines? Well, obviously they're going to say yes. The way you're supposed to do it is to say, could you give me an example of when you had to deal with a tight deadline and how you managed it? And so that's going to force them really to talk much more about their ability in a more truthful way. It is becoming increasingly common to give tests to people, so you can test their ability. So somebody says, I can type and word at 80 words per minute. Why take the risk? Why not set them down, read something to them, see if they can actually type at 80 words a minute on Word? The trouble is, if you recruit the wrong person, it's very expensive. It's not so much that it's hard to get rid of them, because you can until they're there for a while. It's that the recruitment cycle often takes several months. By the time you advertise, they move from their old job and so on. And then you find you got the wrong person, and you have to go through that maybe 3-month cycle again. It's expensive because you haven't got the person you need. So you want to try and get it right. Mentioned intelligence tests and aptitude tests. All sorts of kind of psychological tests to appraise aptitude for various areas. Psychometric tests are looking at your personality, really. Psychometric could be leadership skills. Are you a sort of person who's liable to take initiative, and so on. And then for some jobs we have work samples. An example of this would be if somebody's wanting a job as a website designer, and you say, could you bring in some screenshots or show us perhaps live on the web some sites which you have already designed. So very common in the kind of design field and so on to do these work sample tests and so on. So you don't want to leave as much anything to chance if you can help it. And then out of your, let's say, 5 people you brought to interview and maybe tested, you appoint someone. You send the letter out and you say, we'd like to employ you. And you wait till they say yes before you say no to the others. There may be a little bit of negotiation about wages and terms and when they can actually start. And when that person says yes, then really you should take up references with their current employers. This is where you write to their current employers and ask about the person. It used to be you would ask employers, is this person honest? Are they a good worker? Are they reliable? By and large, that's rare nowadays, but you should be able to ask their current employer, did they join you on this date? What is their current job title? What is their current wages? You should be able to ask them factual questions, and it's almost careless not to do that, because this person could potentially have come along and inflated their wages, inflated their seniority and so on in the organisation. And the appointment is usually made subject to references. So if some untruth or something comes out in the references, you can withdraw the offer of employment. So we have a person we think coming in, and we'll see the first bit of training, we'll see appraisal and so on later on. What I want to look at now, however, is some aspects of the law, fair and legal employment practices, and the major areas for straying into areas which become illegal are where you terminate somebody's employment, or where there's some sort of discrimination which is being gone on within their employment. Many countries now have really quite powerful laws, which, apart from any other moral aspect you may or may not agree with, are very expensive if you don't comply with them. So employment can be ended in 3 ways. A person can retire, they can resign, but where the employer is likely to get into problems is with dismissal, sacking, in other words. And there are 3 forms of dismissal. There is termination, like saying, you are fired, you are dismissed, you are sacked, okay? And that may be legal, it might not be legal. There is ending a fixed term contract without renewal. So if you're hired on a 2-year contract, and even though it looks as though it's temporary, and your employer doesn't renew it, then that person has essentially sacked you. In a way, there's almost no such thing as a temporary contract of employment. And then there is constructive dismissal. This is where the behaviour of the employer has been, in a way, so outrageous that the employee is entitled to assume that they have been dismissed. Now, there are 2 types of wrongfulness or illegality in here. The technical one is wrongful dismissal, where the dismissal breaches a contract of employment, where maybe you're not given enough notice to the person, maybe you don't give them the proper wages for the last week or something of that sort. That is wrongful dismissal. But the more important one is unfair dismissal. That for some reason, when you maybe terminate their employment, you have got no proper grounds to do it. And the areas where it is fair to dismiss someone are as follows. First of all, you can dismiss somebody because of redundancy. So maybe the sales have fallen off, maybe you're closing down a division, or maybe you're cutting 10% of the workforce or something of that sort. You are making the jobs redundant, not the person but the jobs. Then provided you pick the people fairly, then that is fair. So you wouldn't be allowed to make, say, only female staff redundant and keep all the male staff. But something like a kind of last in, first out type of redundancy scheme would be fair. You'll have to pay them some compensation, but that's closely laid down in law. It's not outrageous. It's not too much. Non-capability, where the employee is simply not up to it, is simply not capable of doing their job. Now you have to give them a fair crack of the whip. You have to provide training. You have to provide guidance. You have to provide a certain amount of time where they can practice and improve. But after that, if they still can't do it, if they're still essentially incompetent, you can dismiss them. The law says employers do not have to carry passengers. Sometimes there's a legal restriction. So if you have a delivery driver who, through some sort of driving offence, loses their driving licence, they obviously cannot carry out their job, and it's perfectly legal, perfectly fair to dismiss them, to sack them. Misconduct. 2 sorts of misconduct. You can have what you might call ordinary or mild kind of misconduct, and there you have to go through a kind of warning procedure. Generally speaking, you'll speak to them informally, and then there's what's called a verbal warning, although you make a note about it, and then there's a written warning where you send them a formal letter, and then there's what's called a final written warning. And you have to leave enough time in between these if necessary for them to stop their bad behaviour or to improve. And after the final written warning, if they repeat the offence, then they're out. There are other sorts of offences which are known as gross misconduct, where you can be out immediately. So hitting a member of staff, for example, hitting a customer, theft is likely to be gross misconduct, and you don't have to go through this more careful stage or stages. You don't have to give them a chance of improving their performance or behaviour. And then there can be other substantial reasons. For example, your sales director is married to the sales director of a rival. The law presumes they'll talk about work at home. And if you're frightened of the confidential matters of your company getting through to the rival, then that is fair grounds for dismissal of that person. Dismissal is automatically unfair if you dismiss somebody because they become pregnant, because they're a member of a trade union, because they are carrying out legitimate health and safety procedures, and you say, you're wasting the time doing that, you're dismissed, not allowed to do that. Or if they insist on proper contracts and pay slips, then it is automatically unfair dismissal. Disputes about dismissal, obviously you try to settle them without kind of going to law about it, but the proper venue is what's called an employment tribunal. This is basically a law court, and your employees go there, they're allowed to go with representatives, the employer is there, they sit in front of a kind of tribunal chairman who hears the evidence and who makes a judgment. And if the judgment is for the employee, then the first thing they might be looking for is to get their old job back, reinstatement. But often by the time this has all gone through, somebody else has moved into that job and that job isn't there anymore. The second thing they might go for is re-engagement in a job of similar seniority and similar pay. But actually, by the time people have gone to an employment tribunal, neither really wants to see each other again. And by far the commonest remedy for unfair dismissal are damages. And they can be quite substantial damages paid by the employer to the employee. Equal opportunities is another area where employers can get into serious and very expensive trouble. And in the UK we have got essentially anti-discrimination law or equal opportunities law in these areas. Sex discrimination, the hiring of males versus females, the promotions, the provision of training courses, the rates of pay and so on. If these are found to be different for work of similar value, then the employee may have a case for sex discrimination. It can be quite difficult because traditionally, but not always, it's changing, but traditionally the work that maybe women did in a factory tended to be a bit different to work that men did in a factory. And at one stage it was very difficult to properly compare whether you're paying, let's say, women much less than you're paying men. But the law now says equal pay for work of equal value. So this would mean that somebody maybe working in a canteen is doing work maybe as valuable as some people working in the factory. And the various ways of trying to assess the value, maybe in terms of the skills they have and how much training they need and so on, to see whether or not the pay should be equal. We have to be very careful about this. We'll see that it's very easy to maybe unconsciously get into discrimination, and the penalties are severe. We're not allowed to discriminate on the basis of race, or on religion, or on sexual orientation, whether someone is straight or gay. We're not allowed now to discriminate on the basis of age. And this is quite interesting. Who should get the promotion? Should it be the person who's 60 or should it be the person who's maybe 30? We're not supposed to discriminate on that. It may be difficult to prove discrimination if the 30-year-old gets a promotion rather than the 60-year-old, but in theory it's not allowed. And disability, where employers have to make reasonable adjustments to allow disabled people to work. And what is a reasonable adjustment depends on the size of the company. So if a company has got an office at the ground floor and the first floor, if it's a company with maybe just kind of 4 people in it, it probably can't afford to put in a lift. So they wouldn't be expected to put in a lift to allow a disabled person maybe to work on the top floor. But if it's a company with maybe 200 people in it, then a lift would be normal, and they would be expected to accommodate the disabled person by putting in the lift. In general, there are 3 possible types of discrimination. Direct discrimination. So if you put an advert in the paper saying what we want is a salesman, you're going to be in big trouble. It has to be a salesperson or a sales representative. It has to be kind of gender neutral. Indirect discrimination is where many people come to grief. This is where you advertise and there's some quality or something about your advertising that is going to be favouring one sex versus the other sex or one race versus another race. So if, as it says here, you want a sales representative, that's neutral, but you say the sales representative has to be 2 meters tall and a big black beard, then of course you are ruling out most women and you've got indirect discrimination there. There was a famous kind of case that a company advertised for people who were less than about 5 meters 70, and this is for safety because there was an overhead rail with machinery coming along it, and if you were too tall you were liable to get your hair caught in it or your head hit or something of this sort. But that was regarded as being indirect discrimination, discriminating against men, because men are on average taller than women, and there'd be more men who'd be ruled out because of that height restriction than women. And finally there is victimization. Victimization is where an employee who's taken their employer to an employment tribunal is then treated less favourably, is maybe kind of name called, maybe doesn't get a promotion, etc. Nobody sits beside them at lunch and all this kind of stuff. That is victimization, and that is a form of discrimination. And if that happens, you can take them all over again to the employment tribunal.